Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well today. This is Psych 598E, Evolutionary Psychology. Going to record my lecture. Today I'm going to talk about the same thing that Lucia was going to talk about in hers, and that is violence. I want to talk about the evolution of violence today. Before we begin, let's mention we got the term paper assignment. The term paper assignment is on the front page of the Canvas site, and so you ought to check that out if you haven't yet. You have until finals week to do the term paper, and you ought to let me know if you have any questions while you're doing it. My email address for all of this is ecooper@istate.edu, and of course, if you have anything questions about the lecture today, you can also send it there. Okay, but let's get into it. I'm going to do the lecture on violence. I'll see how long it goes, and then depending on how long it goes, we may talk about something else as well today. So we'll just see. So, the question is, I want to address is, have people evolved to be violent? A lot of people would say they have not. So there is an SSSM explanation of violence, and that is, violence is a behavior taught by culture. Violence is behavior taught by culture. Now, some of you may be aware, Iowa State is kind of the world headquarters of SSSM explanations of violence. So many of the people in our social psych area here study violence and tend to favor SSSM explanations. And that was why I was hoping always that there would be some kind of social psych student who would take the class and could maybe help explain their position. So I'm going to try and explain their position as best as I understand it for why the evidence for SSSM explanation. But I really do wish that Minju, she stopped coming to class, and she might have had some insights here. But I'll do the best I can to try and give an intellectually honest portrayal of what the SSSM position is. And so one piece of evidence for the SSSM position is that, yes, cultures do vary widely in their amount of violence. If we look at industrialized cultures, you're probably aware many European cultures have far less violence than we do in the United States. Canada has far less violence than we do in the United States. And so the suggestion is that, that's right. Violence varies by culture. Ipso facto, violence is a behavior that's taught by culture, and we could use violence to, we could therefore use our culture to reduce violence. So the evidence, I've alluded to this when I was talking, the evidence for the SSSM explanation is that cultures vary widely in the amount of violence their people exhibit. Okay, like we talked about, different countries around the world, industrialized countries differ a lot in their rates of violence. We're going to talk about non-industrialized cultures a little later on, but they fit this mold as well. Let's just say that they are going to have very different rates of violence than the industrialized cultures, and I'll leave it for a second for you to think about which way that might go. Are they more violent or less violent? Okay, and the idea is that, it might be we have lots of violent movies, video games, TV shows. Americans consume a lot of that. We have this frontier culture that a lot of other cultures didn't have, where people were in the Wild West kind of fending for themselves, didn't have authorities to go to. And so the sort of gun culture that we have in the United States and the kind of culture of rugged individualism is what leads people to be violent. I had big arguments with Dr. Bushman when he was here. He left for Ohio State a while ago about whether people had evolved to be violent. Because from my perspective is The decision to engage in violence is an evolutionarily very consequential one. We know many animal species do engage in violence and are violent. We know some aren't. We talked about some of those, like the gibbons aren't. So it seemed to me it's very obvious that there would be some sort of evolutionary module for engaging in violence, deciding when to engage in violence. I took, not only did I argue with Dr. Bushman about this, I actually, when I was planning to teach the Psych 101 class here, I sat in on the class the semester before I was going to teach it to see what it was like and to see what things worked and didn't in the class. And so I sat through the social psych portion of the class, and Rick Gibbons was teaching that. He's not on the faculty anymore, but they said the same thing in the intro psych class. They said that no, there's evidence is very, very good that people did not evolve to be violent. Nobody evolved to be violent. Well, I didn't understand where this was coming from. Why would people say that we haven't evolved to be violent when clearly violence is present in pretty much all cultures in the world with all people, although there is variation, and lots of animals engage in violence. Well, I looked at the textbook we use for the social psych class. It's by Myers. And I looked to see what they said in it about violence. And it said, yes, explicitly, people haven't evolved to be violent. And what they began with was talking about early theories of violence, like ethologists, people who study animal behavior, like Konrad Lorenz. They claim violence was an instinct. The animals have an instinct for violence. Well, instincts kind of become a nasty word within psychology because there was a time when pretty much everybody was trying to explain everything by saying, well, you got an instinct for that. And that really doesn't explain anything. So they would talk about instincts. Well, it doesn't, yes, violence does not bear the kind of the classic trappings of what a animal behaviorist would call an instinct. Well, the classic behavior of an instinct would be something like the stickleback fish attacking a red spot. So the male stickleback fish, what it will see, the underneath side of the fish has a red spot on it. And so whenever the male stickleback fish sees another male stickleback fish with this red spot, it immediately attacks the red spot. And it can't turn this off, and it'll attack anything with a similar red spot. You can just take just like a popsicle stick, put a red spot on that, and stick it in the water, and the stickleback fish will attack it. And it'll do that even if it would injure itself, like if it had to go through some thorns in order to attack this thing. Doesn't matter. As soon as it sees that red thing, boom, it's going to ignore everything else and immediately attack the red spot. And so the concept of an instinct in animal behavior is when the animal's presented with some stimulus and it responds to that stimulus, no matter what the consequences would be. It just can't shut it off. And really there aren't, correctly I would say, there aren't really any human behaviors that seem to be like that of the stickleback fish, so we really can't say that humans have an instinct in that sense. But that doesn't mean they might not have a module that's a little more sophisticated or a lot more sophisticated than the stickleback fish that is able to assess when violence might be a good thing to do and revolutionarily and when it wouldn't be. So Myers in this social psych textbook dismisses Lorenz because he said violence was an instinct and that's not really scientific. And then he says, well, if we were evolved to be violent, then we'd just be beating up people all the time for no apparent reason, and we wouldn't be able to stop, and clearly we're not doing that, so ipso facto, violence must be learned. Well, no, I don't think any evolved creature would engage in violence all the time for no specific reason. There are lots of violent animals. None of them behave that way. It would be crazy to set up a neural circuit that behaves in that fashion, that causes you to be violent all the time for no reason. Obviously, engaging in violence is a very substantial, a decision with a lot of consequences if you're an animal, because you could potentially die and then not pass along your genes. And so it's really got to be worth it for you to engage in violence. So no, we wouldn't expect, if you had a module for being violent, we wouldn't expect it to operate in such a way that you're being violent all the time. That would be crazy. So, I think the social psych arguments that there's no module for violence. I'm not saying there's no influence of the culture on whether people tend to be violent, but I certainly do think that there is a module for violence. And I'm going to follow Pinker's discussion. Pinker, 2002, argues that violence is at least partially an evolved contingent mechanism. Okay, Pinker, 2002, argues that violence is at least partially an evolved contingent mechanism. And so I'm going to make some of the same arguments that he made in his 2002 book, The Blank Slate. That's where a lot of this is coming from. Well, what's a contingent mechanism? Contingent mechanism is an evolved behavior that is employed in certain environmental circumstances. Contingent mechanism, an evolved behavior that's employed in certain environmental circumstances. So he's arguing that that's what violence is, that you do have a module to be violent, but it doesn't make you violent constantly all the time. It's a part of your brain that says, okay, if you're in a particular situation, well, in this situation you should be violent. We can come up with other contingent mechanisms that don't have anything to do with violence in the human body. These aren't really psychological mechanisms, but let's talk about the callus-producing mechanism as a contingent mechanism people often talk about. So if you have friction on your skin, repeated friction on your skin, eventually there's a process in your body that will thicken the skin, develop a callus in that area in order to protect your skin, essentially, because you're putting a lot of friction on it. Now, so you don't develop calluses all over your body. It's going to make you less sensitive to touch if you do that. What you have is a contingent mechanism. The callus-producing mechanism kicks in whenever you're experiencing a lot of friction repeatedly on the skin in a particular area. Otherwise, it doesn't. And so Pinker is saying that essentially the violence module is the same way. There are certain circumstances in which people have evolved to engage in violent behavior, and it's only under those circumstances that they're going to engage in that behavior. And they're not going to be like the stickleback fish, not take any other information into account when they're in one of those situations. Now, they're going to take a lot of information into account, but eventually you have a module up there, and under the right set of circumstances, it would engage and cause people to be violent. That's the idea. Okay, well, let's talk about, and again, this is not evidence that there's no effect of the culture. I don't think anybody can argue there's no effect of the culture. But let's talk about evidence that humans have evolved. How about an evolved module to be violent? Evidence that humans have an evolved module to be violent. All right, number one, and some of these come from Pinker and some don't, so some come from me. Humanity's nearest relatives in the animal world are very violent. Okay? So we share more DNA with chimpanzees than any other animal. And we've talked about chimpanzees before. Chimpanzees engage in violent competition to establish a pecking order. So the best fighter in the chimpanzee band, he's the alpha male, and then there's a pecking order for all the other males in the chimpanzee band that's been established through combat. That determines how frequently they get to mate. And so when a female in the tribe, in the group, goes into heat, typically all the adult males get to have sex with her during the 2-week period she's in heat. But the alpha male gets the most matings, and he gets, during the time she's most fertile, he gets by far the most matings during that period. So chimpanzees everywhere in the world engage in violent combat in order to establish this pecking order. The animal we're next most closely related to is the gorilla, and we've talked about them before as well. What happens is really only about 1 in 3 gorillas or so actually get to mate, and they establish a harem, and it's by beating up other males and keeping other males away from their harem. So that's why gorillas are so big and strong and so much bigger than their females, is they are engaging in violent competition in order to establish mates. So now one could argue against this. The idea is, okay, we had a common ancestor with chimpanzees about 7 million years ago, and a common ancestor with gorillas about 10 million years ago, and presumably that ancestor was in common with chimps as well. And so those creatures, that creature 10 million years ago that we shared in common with the gorillas, well, that appeared to have a module for violence, and that module for violence is present in both the gorillas and the chimpanzees. Now, of course, we aren't chimpanzees. We evolved after the chimpanzees, and so one could argue reasonably that, yes, okay, the gorillas and the chimpanzees have a module for being violent, but humans don't. So that is possible. However, I don't think it's as parsimonious as presuming, well, we inherited that same module that the gorillas and the chimpanzees have. One thing, however, that makes me think that did not happen is there's a particular form of behavior that only 2 animal species in the world have ever been shown to engage in. Now we know 10 million, there have been 10 million animal species identified, over 4,000 different mammalian species identified, and of all those species, there are only 2 that engage in what is called male coalition violence. Male coalition violence, where males from one social group, a group of males, no females, from one social group will go out and engage in combat with a group of males from another social group. So that's male coalition violence. Only 2 species out of 10 million known have ever been shown to engage in this behavior, and they're right together on the evolutionary tree. And I don't know if you know what they are. Yeah, chimpanzees and humans. Chimpanzees and humans are the only animals that have been shown to engage in male coalition violence. And I think the most parsimonious explanation of that has to be, okay, well, we evolved from a common ancestor that engaged in male coalition violence. So I think that is very interesting. More interesting, I think, than that the gorillas and the chimps are violent is only chimps and humans engage in male coalition violence. Okay, so second piece of evidence that humans have an evolved module to be violent. Male humans are larger than female humans. Differences in the size of the sexes have only been found in species where males compete violently for mates. Male humans are larger than female humans. Differences in the size of the sexes have only been found in species where males compete violently for mates. So, if there is a difference in the size of the sexes, it's almost always the case that, at least among mammals, the male is the larger one. And the reason is that they engage in violence with other males in order to get mating opportunities. Remember, because of parental investment, males are going to engage, are more willing to engage in competition for mating opportunities. So there are some animals that don't compete violently for mates. Gibbons would be our nearest relative that are like that. The male and female gibbon are virtually identical in size. It's very difficult to just look at their bodies and tell which one is the male or female. They mate for life, and the males do not fight with one another for opportunities for females. However, both chimpanzees and gorillas, as we discussed, there is fighting that goes on in competition for mating opportunities, and as a result, males of those species have evolved to be larger than the females. In the case of the gorillas, quite a bit larger than the females. Well, if you look at human males and females, human males about 12% larger than human females. And really, the size of the size difference really indicates how much violent competition goes on. I think I mentioned the sea lion, where the male sea lions are like 8 times as big as the female sea lions. They don't even look like they're the same species. And that's because only like 1 in 8 male sea lions gets to mate. So extreme violent competition for mating opportunities for them. And so that's why there's this huge sex difference. What the fairly small, only 12% difference between male and females is that suggests that we're sort of violent, but not super violent. But it does suggest that humans have evolved, at least human males, to be a little bit violent. Now, of all the pieces of evidence I'm going to present, I think this is the best one. And I'd be interested in hearing from anybody who has another explanation for why males are bigger than females, not just in humans, but in any species. But as far as I know, you can almost perfectly predict how much violent male competition goes on by looking at the size difference between males and females. And among humans in all cultures, males are bigger than females. All right. Number 3. Stop it. 3. A. Physiological fight or flight response occurs in humans when they are threatened. Okay, occurs in humans, but occurs in pretty much all mammals when they are threatened. So probably, there we go. Get it back on the screen. Let me move this up. Okay, physiological fight or flight response occurs in humans when they are threatened. Well, not just humans, but all mammals. Now, thinking back to your physiological psych, you might remember there are 2 divisions of your peripheral nervous system. There is the somatic nervous system, and that's one you have voluntary control over, where you walk around and pick up things and sit and stand, and your voluntary movements are all controlled by the somatic nervous system. But you'll also remember the other division is the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, it happens automatically. The autonomic nervous system has 2 divisions. One is the sympathetic and the other is the parasympathetic nervous system. And the whole purpose of the sympathetic nervous system, it originates in the spinal cord, is to get you revved up when you're in a life-threatening situation. And so this fight or flight response, there are a number of different responses that occur in response to the fight or flight response. So these include things like your heart rate goes up, your blood vessels are going to constrict, so if you're cut, you'll bleed less. You liberate fat and glycogen. You burn those immediately so that you'll have some blood sugar in your bloodstream that you can use for energy. You're going to have tunnel vision. You'll lose peripheral vision and just kind of see what's right ahead of you. Often it'll result in shaking, more blood flow to the muscles, and then less blood flow to, say, digestion, for example. Digestion slows down during the fight or flight response. And then you're bathed in sweat. And so you can see that all of these things are things that would limit the damage to you if you were involved in a fight and help you to fight better, like having the increased glucose stores, the adrenaline to increase your ability, increased heart rate, constriction of blood vessels. All of these things would potentially help you when you're in a fight. And you probably notice that people bare their canine teeth when they get angry, just like animals do. And again, that's part of the fight or flight response. So it is called the fight or flight response. And so I would think so the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for starting the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic nervous system, after the danger is past, it slows the body back down and gets you back to normal. So essentially you have an entire division of your peripheral nervous system that is devoted to violence, I would say, devoted to helping you win a fight. So I always thought it was a little weird in Psych 101 when they go through the physiology section of the class. They talk about how the human nervous system has a evolved fight or flight response. And then when we got to the social psych section of the class, they told us the human nervous system has not evolved to be violent. Well, no, I would say the fight or flight response shows we have evolved to be violent. The entire sympathetic nervous system is set up for that. Now, here's the alternative. One could say, if you were an SSSM theorist, well, it's not really a fight response, it's a flight response. So, yeah, getting sweaty cools you down, also makes you slick so you can get away. All the things I just mentioned would help you get away from whatever the danger is. So they might say, well, no, it's not a fight or flight response, it's just a flight response that you're having. Well, okay, so whatever you think about that could go either way. All right, number 4. Toddlers are the most violent humans, although they are least exposed to culture. Elderly people are the least violent, although they are most exposed to violent culture. Okay, well, if people were by nature peaceful and then have to learn to be violent, what we'd expect is, well, you'd be very nonviolent when you were a baby, and then throughout the course of your life, as you're exposed to more and more violent culture, well, then you'll become more and more violent. Well, there was a study by Tremblay, and what he looked at is people of different ages and how likely they were during the course of a day to engage in hitting and kicking and biting behavior. And what they found is that the ages where people are most likely to engage in actual violence against another person is between the ages of 2 and 4. That's when people are most violent. And I think, well, I don't know if you remember your toddler days. I don't remember too much about them, but one thing I do remember is how nasty little kids are to one another, and they'll hit each other. And yeah, I can remember one real nasty kid at the daycare hitting me in the head a bunch of times. So yeah, little kids are super violent, and so it seems like you have to learn not to be violent. I don't think those kids are watching a lot of violent television or movies or playing violent video games at that age. It's more like you have to learn not to be violent than to learn to be violent. Now, going the other way, if it was exposure to violent culture, if that was the sole cause of violence, well, when you see an 83-year-old woman walking down the street, you'd say, oh my God, that woman is a ticking time bomb. She's been exposed to 83 years of violent American culture. She could go off in any second. Well, no, as you age, you become less and less likely to be violent. Women and men in their 80s are extremely unlikely to engage in violent behavior. It's virtually unknown. And so that would appear to be, again, not consistent with an entirely SSSM theory. Now, I had some students before when I've presented this suggest, well, maybe old people, they really want to engage in violence, but they realize they're too weak to engage in violence, and so they have a strong desire to do so, but they realize their frailty won't allow them to do it, so that's why they aren't violent. I don't know. I guess meeting old people I've met have never expressed an actual interest in engaging in violence. They don't seem to have that as a big interest in their lives, but I suppose it is possible. You wouldn't think it'd be that hard to get a gun and start, shooting up the place, even if you were a frail 83-year-old, but I guess that's possible. It's also possible with the toddler stuff that, hey, toddlers do a bunch of crazy stuff that adults don't do, eat their own feces, as well as engaging in violence and other crazy stuff. So maybe toddlers, they're just engaging in lots and lots of different behaviors, more so than adults do, just to try things out. So maybe they aren't just inherently violent, it's just that they are engaging in a bunch of different behaviors to, see what the consequences are of those behaviors, and violence happens to be one of them. So this may not be, again, I think it's pretty good evidence, but I can also see how somebody would say it's maybe not good evidence. All right, number 5. Okay, cultures which have no violent media, which I mean Stone Age cultures, are the most violent cultures which have no violent media, Stone Age cultures are the most violent. Well, we've been told the U.S. is a horribly, horribly violent culture, and compared to Europe and Canada, we just have all this violence, and it's so awful. And you may have thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great to live in the EEA? I bet during the EEA, everybody was so peaceful and wonderful. They would just peacefully spend the day hunting and gathering. At the end of the day, they'd have a luau on the beach, and everybody was peaceful and happy together. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live in the wonderful, peaceful EEA rather than our miserable, violent American culture? All right, well, let's look at some of the data on these Stone Age cultures. These are primarily cultures, the ones I'm going to show you, the Stone Age cultures, are in, New Guinea and South America. So I don't know, Jivaro and the Yanomamo, I'm pretty sure are in South America. The others I'm not sure about, but I hope you can see the graph here. And what this is the percentage of male deaths. This is caused by warfare, but warfare does kill a lot more people than, say, violence involved in a crime like violent assault. So this does include most of the homicides. And what you can see is that for, this is Europe, U.S. and Europe in the 20th century, just a tiny percentage of people, looks like less than 1% probably, less than 1% of males die due to violence. But in Stone Age cultures, it is the main cause of males being violent. It's only it's the majority cause in the Jivaro, but I bet it's the plurality cause. That is, more deaths are caused by violence than anything else in almost all the others. I would argue that the biological incentives in a Stone Age tribe, typically which allow polygamy, so males can have multiple wives, there's a much greater incentive evolutionarily to be violent than in modern American culture. And Steve Pinker has written another book, I think it's The Better Angels of Our Nature, about how much violence has been reduced among humans over the past, really over human history. So his whole argument in his other book is that humans are getting less and less and less and less violent, and as people get wealthier in particular, people tend to engage in less violence rather than more. I'm not saying I suggest his other book. It was so long. I just kept reading it and begging for it to end. What he goes through is every single possible type of violence: child abuse, violence against homosexuals, religious violence, violence based on race, every possible motive for violence, and then shows how it's been reduced over the centuries, and then deals with every possible counter-argument in the book as well. So it goes on forever. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but by the end, you're willing to say, yeah, okay, modern cultures are way, way, way less violent than Stone Age cultures are. So we're actually becoming a lot less violent, not more violent. All right, so that's number 5. Number 6, sixth piece of evidence that there's a module for engaging in violence, and that is, in every culture examined, men are far more violent than women. Parental investment theory would predict that men would be more inclined than women to engage in risky strategies like violence. Okay. In every culture examined, men are far more violent than women. Parental investment theory would predict that men would be more inclined than women to engage in risky strategies like violence. Okay, I'm going to show you a table here. This table is a summary of same-sex homicides. This is males killing males killing other males, or females killing other females. I think this is as big as I can make it. Now, if you can't see it, I'll try to make it a little bigger. If you can't see it, I'm going to read it for you a little bit. That might help. All right, let me read it for you. So what we've got is these are, it's kind of it was a meta-analysis here. So we're looking at different studies that have actually tracked male-on-male violence and female-on-female violence, both of them, in different cultures. And what you can see is pretty much every continent. We got North America here, we got South America, Australia, we got Europe, we got Asia here, we got Africa. So cultures from all over the world. And what they have is the number of times a male killed a male and the number of times a female killed a female for various time periods. And over here, this got cut off, but this is the proportion of all of these murders that were males killing males. And what you can see is it's over 94%, almost always. There's a 93. Outlier here is Denmark, where only 85% of the killings were male on male. But you can see a lot of cultures, 100% of the killings were male on male, and there were no female on female murders. And it looks like, if we go down the list, I would guess it's probably 96% of all same-sex murders are one male killing another male. So this is not something that varies with culture. In all cultures that have ever been studied, males engage in more violence than do females. Why can't I get this one? All right. Okay. Now, let's talk about then what males would have the greatest Darwinian incentive in order to engage in violence. So, if you look, I'm going to ask you to think about this before I tell you the answer. So in what 10-year period of a male's life is he most likely to be convicted of a violent crime, where he was did something violent enough that it could be considered a crime? Okay, and so what 10-year period? So like when he's 46 to 56, or 55 to 75, or 35 to 45. What 10-year period? Okay, I use a lot of fives. 38 to 48. Whatever. So think about that for a second. And then I will reveal it to you. The answer is 15 to 25. And I bet a lot of you got it or were really, really close. That 10-year period, 15 to 25, is by far the most violent time in a man's life. You will get some men still engaging in violence even up to age 35, but it is very very uncommon for anybody after the age of 35 to commit a violent crime. And if you are somebody who's made it to the age of 30 without ever committing a violent crime, then it's extremely unlikely that you will ever do so. People are violent when they're young, and it's really young men who commit almost all the violence in every single culture that has ever been studied in the history of the world. So, the question for you is, what else is going on between the ages of 15 and 25? And the answer is, yes, you're competing for mates as well. So, not surprising at all that men are being violent during that period. In most other mammals that engage in interspecies violence, what's going on is males are competing for mates, and that appears to be what's going on here too. Probably in this case, they're committing crimes that require violence to gain the resources to get mates. But of course, males, because they have to compete for mating opportunities in a way females do not, have far stronger Darwinian incentive to engage in violence than females do. If they don't engage in violence, they could be completely shut out of the possibility to mate. So we would expect males to be more willing to engage in violence than females simply because of parental investment theory, and that is the case in every culture that's ever been studied. That is, I think, after the difference in sizes between males and females, that's the second best piece of evidence. This is a phenomenon that occurs cross-culturally. Now, females need to aggress against one another as well sometimes, but it would make sense that they wouldn't want to, that competition shouldn't get violent. They want to stay alive. Females don't have to worry about finding a mate, so particularly in the EEA where you could get Males could usually have multiple wives. Almost certainly a female would be able to find a husband if she wanted to. So she wants to just stay alive, and that's why engaging in violence wouldn't be very beneficial evolutionarily for a female. Well, how do females usually aggress against one another? And that's typically verbally. They aggress verbally, so they're not in real any danger, but they still do aggress. It's just not through physical violence. Okay, well, I think a lot of these pieces of evidence, particularly number 2, that male humans are larger than females, and number 6, that it's males 15 to 25 is when the highest crime exists, but you will still get some hardcore male criminals that are violent up to age 35. That is true, but virtually all the violent crime in every culture that's ever been considered is from males 15 to 35, and I think that's a very good argument of an evolutionary basis for violence as well. Okay, so why would people engage in violence? Well, I'm going to argue from Pinker as well. Pinker 2002 argues there are 3 evolutionary reasons why people would engage in violence. Okay, number 1 is to acquire resources that help them pass on their genes, and that would be primarily food and mates. Okay, well, if you're in the situation that you're about to die because you don't have enough food or you can't get a mate, then violence would be one way to go about acquiring those things. Napoleon Chagnon, I think that's how you say, I have a terrible time saying his name because he's French. You may have heard of him, Napoleon Chagnon. He's famous for studying the Yanomamo people, and he wrote a very famous book in anthropology after he went down and lived with them for a period of time called The Fierce People, where he describes his life with them. So they were an extremely violent South American tribe. And before he went down there, it was assumed that most violence was occurring between tribes to get food. But no, the males in the Yanomamo tribe that Chagnon studied were very upfront. They said, no, we want to go and kill males in this other tribe and take their women. They wanted additional mates through violence, and that would often be the best way to get additional mates is through violence. It's okay to take a guy from another tribe's woman, cause conflict in your tribe if you took another guy's woman, but if you kill a guy in another tribe and bring his wife back, well, that's not going to cause any trouble in your tribe. So that's one reason, of course, that people would engage in violence. We should also point out it's almost always universal that lower status males are a lot more likely to engage in violence than higher status males. The idea is that if you are at the bottom of the reproductive heap and you do not see any way to pass along your genes through normal methods, well, you may reach a point where you have nothing to lose by engaging in violence. Violence that may take the form of sexual violence, where the individual engages in rape, or more likely it would probably be criminal violence that allows the person to acquire resources that would help them to attract a mate. But high-status males typically won't engage in violent criminal behavior because they have too much to lose. They can acquire mates without engaging in violence. Some guy who is completely shut out from the mate market and cannot acquire a mate on his own, he has very, very little to lose evolutionarily by engaging in violence. This is one reason why some people think that monogamy laws are perhaps necessary for industrialized society. If males can have more than one mate, then they're going to spend lots and lots of time evolutionarily fighting with other males to try and acquire their mates for themselves. That's the best way to increase your reproductive capacity in the EEA if you are allowed to have multiple wives, is to engage in violence to acquire some. On the other hand, if there are monogamy laws and you can't acquire multiple mates, well, after you've acquired your mate, well, then it doesn't make much sense to engage in violence after that. And so if we did not have monogamy laws, the argument is there might be fighting all the time among males for mates, and so no polygamous society is ever going to get very far because males have a lot more to gain by engaging in violence and tearing one another down rather than trying to be productive and become rich and build oneself up. Now, the other argument that relates to this is it might be a good thing to allow some prostitution in a society. And in fact, prostitution is a cultural universal. It's been found in all cultures where men are giving women resources to women they aren't married to in exchange for sex. And the idea is that what prostitution allows is that the lower status males in your society actually have an opportunity to pass along their genes or to have sex through prostitutes. Maybe not pass along their genes, but at least have some sort of sexual release. And if you didn't have that, then somebody at the bottom of the heap, the only alternative they have is maybe to engage in violent crime in order to attract a mate. And so the idea is that if prostitution could be totally eliminated, well, what we'd see in consequence is a great increase in the number of rapes. And so maybe, prostitution should not only be legalized, it should also be encouraged. Now, there are some negatives for having prostitution in your society as well. And so, maybe think of the negatives. Most obvious negative, I would think, is spreading of disease. And so if you've got venereal diseases in your society, you've got lots of men having sex with one woman. If she acquires the disease, of course, that disease is going to spread throughout your society. And so I think that may be part of the reason for the prohibition in most societies is that's disease spreading. But, these days, condoms, birth control, penicillin, we got a lot of ways to protect yourself. And so, these days, I think maybe that's not such a big deal. So maybe we might be able to reduce the amount of rape by legalizing prostitution. I'm not sure about that, of course. All right, number 2, second evolutionary benefit from engaging in violence, and that's to protect oneself from violent attacks by others. Protect oneself from violent attacks by others. Okay, even if you're a high-status male, has no trouble getting mates, because you have all these mates, you become a target for a low-status male who might want to kill you and take your mates. And so, even if you're a high-status male who would never consider in a million years engaging in violence to acquire a mate, you still have to be able to defend yourself if you have violence engaged against you. And so certainly in the EEA there's going to be a lot of warfare and a lot of people trying to kill you to take your mate. So you've got to be able to protect yourself even if you don't want to be a particularly violent person. I like to use analogies from video games. I'll use a Civilization 6 analogy here. If you play Civ 6, well, there are a number of ways to win at Civilization. You control a civilization and you build it, and then there are other civilizations you're competing against. And there are ways to peacefully win the game. However, the problem is, let's say you'd like to start a peaceful situation that doesn't spend any of its resources on war. The problem is that there are going to be other civilizations. If you're playing a game with like Napoleon or Shaka Zulu, those guys are crazy, and they are going to attack you just to attack you, even if you haven't done anything to harm them. And so, unfortunately, in Civilization 6, even if you would like to play a peaceful society and win in a peaceful way, you have to spend a lot of resources on your military, because you have to be able to stop aggressors if they aggress against you. All right, and then number 3 is to protect and enhance one's reputation for fighting. To protect and enhance one's reputation for fighting. So if you win a fight very decisively and you show that you're a really, really good fighter, that can be a good thing because it could deter people in the future who might want to take your resources or your mates from fighting with you. I've seen that dude fight. He is too tough for me. I'm not going to mess with him. So actually engaging in one violent act can prevent future violent acts. But further, that will enhance your status on the mate market. That is one of the things that makes you attractive to mates, and particularly in Stone Age societies, warriorship is probably the main way in which one gains status. So there's a study Buss describes in his book, Anthropological Study, where they measured the warriorship, the number of people in battle a particular member of a tribe had killed, and they also pulled the members of the tribe and asked to rate the status of different members in the tribe. A very strong correlation for males. It was a correlation about positive 0.6 between the warriorship, the number of people they killed in battle, and their perceived status in the tribe. So it moves you up the status hierarchy. If you're a good fighter, it also shows potential mates that, yeah, you'd be able to protect them if they've seen you fight. So we'd expect when females are choosing mates that they ought to consider fighting ability as one of the things. If you remember, when we were talking about things that males like and the females like in mates, one of the things that females cared about but males didn't was body size and physical strength. And that's consistent with this. Okay, well, I would just add two more kind of, I don't know, maybe anecdotal things that also make me convinced that there is an evolved module for violence. So me and my brother would fight violently when we were little kids, but really since I've been 12, I've never actually engaged in violence with anybody. But there have been 2 times when the violence module really went off for me. In both times, I felt like I was talking with another male, and in both cases, it was another male I was sure I would be able to beat up. I was way bigger than both of them. And in both cases, this smaller guy had mildly insulted me twice within about 15 minutes, and in both cases I just really wanted to hit the guy in the face. I mean, I wanted to so bad I had to clench my teeth not to do that, and I didn't do it, but I could tell that module went off for me, and it was only afterwards I realized that what the cases had in common. It was a guy I knew I could beat up, and he'd insulted me a couple times mildly. They weren't nasty insults, but enough that they would have lowered my status had other people been there. And in both cases, wow, I really wanted to smack them across the face really bad, but I did resist. So that's one thing that convinces me there's a module. It was only after I'd felt that way that I figured out what the cases had in common. Second thing is, I don't know, did any of you, we'll ask this by sex, did any of you ever play games when you were a child, like 1st and 2nd grade, where you would engage in mock violence with other kids? These games go by a lot of names: Cops and Robbers, Cowboys and Indians, War. We used to play Germans and Americans, I remember, in 1st grade outside and pretend to shoot at each other and stuff like that. So how many of you played games of that sort? Usually when I ask, all the males will raise their hands, and sometimes some of the females will too. So this appears to be a common thing in childhood, and I can remember it being really super fun playing those games, to engage in mock violence like that. And so what that suggests to me is that, little kids, pretty much all little boys, for as long as there have been little boys, have enjoyed engaging in mock violence with other little boys. They're playing as a way of practicing, getting ready for engaging in real violence when they're adults. That's why they like to play violence. It's like little doggy Rosie. Her favorite game is wrestling, where I'll put on some gloves and then lay with my stomach on the bed, and I'll try and catch her, and she will try and bite the gloves, and so we fight like that and wrestle like that. So that's her favorite game. She just loves that, and she's engaging in pretend violence as practice for real violence, because why expend the energy to play games like that unless it was practice for something else? Well, I know you guys don't play childish games like Cops and Robbers anymore. Now you've moved on to Call of Duty and Battlefield 4 and other games like that. So I'm glad you're not doing childish stuff like that anymore. Okay, well, I want to talk about one last topic under violence, and this is kind of a social psych thing. And I think this is really interesting. This is the effects of culture on violence. So I wanted to talk about, I said at the beginning, yeah, clearly culture does affect violence, but I hope at this point you're convinced, well, I think there's also a module, the sympathetic nervous system, for engaging in violence as well. But let's talk about what is the role of culture in determining violence. I want to talk about the work of Nisbet and Cohen. And they published this first in 1996. They argue that engaging in violence to enhance one's reputation will be most likely to arise in societies far from the law, in which economic assets can be easily stolen, e.g., herd animals. Such societies are called cultures of honor. Cultures of honor. Okay. So, let's talk about Nisbet and Cohen's theory here. So what Nisbet and Cohen point out is before the Industrial Revolution, there were two primary ways in which different human societies made a living. If you're in an area with fertile farmland, then typically people would make a living doing farming. But in contrast, if you lived in an area where there wasn't fertile farmland, like the desert or the mountains, for example, well, those people would typically engage in herding, which requires less fertile land than farming does. And what Nisbet and Cohen argue is if you look at these different cultures, farming cultures and herding cultures, what you see is that the herding cultures tend to be a lot more violent than the farming cultures. Now, the reason is that if you're in a farming culture, you're probably near the authorities, so there's some authority nearby you could call on if someone engaged in violence against you. And your assets are in terms of crops and land, neither of which are very easy to steal, so you don't really have to worry about somebody coming in the night and harvesting all your corn and taking it away. So in those cultures, it really doesn't make sense to be particularly violent. It makes sense to go to the authorities when you need, if this crime has been committed against you, rather than doing it yourself. And so farming societies tend to be very peaceful without a lot of violence. The contrast would be with herding societies. In herding societies, the people's assets is entirely in terms of the animals that they own, because they typically don't own land. And those animals are very easy to steal. And so you've got to be constantly worried that other people might kill you and take away your herding animals. And so people in herding cultures tend to develop a hair-trigger temper, particularly for any stain on their reputation. Because if somebody publicly insults you about something, this could be them probing you to see if you're soft. If you don't engage in some sort of violent response to an insult, this may tell them, this is a soft guy who's not willing to engage in violence. He would be easy to steal from. So having a reputation that you're not soft, that you can't be messed with, that you will engage in violence in response to an insult, that's very important in a herding culture. I was watching like AMC. It was Sean Connery's birthday, and they had a bunch of Sean Connery movies on. And one of the movies they had on was the movie The Man Who Would Be King. And The Man Who Would Be King, Sean Connery and Michael Caine play these British soldiers, and they're stationed in India, and they've heard about this mythical kingdom in Afghanistan that no European has ever visited, and they think with their modern weapons, if they went to that kingdom, well, they could become the kings of that kingdom. And so they decide to take this trek over the mountains into Afghanistan. And as they're going over the mountains, there's this one scene, and there's no word spoken in the whole scene. It just goes by in about 15 seconds. But they're walking along this mountain pass, and there's this little kid. He can't be more than 5, so 5 at most. And you can see behind him, there's a bunch of animals behind him, and he is holding a gun and a musket, and he is pointing it as Michael Caine and Sean Connery walk past this trail and walk past him. The little kid has the gun pointed on him the whole time. And they both put their hands up, and they smile, and they say hello to show that they're not a threat. But that's the way you had to live if you were a herder living in those times. There's going to be people all the time ready to steal your stuff. And so you had to be constantly guarding your assets, and that includes even 5-year-olds might have to guard your assets for you. So herding cultures tend to be a lot more violent than farming cultures. And so the sort of cultures we're talking about we have the Scottish Highlanders, who were herders, and they were very violent. Scottish Lowlanders were farmers. They were not. Appalachian mountain men like the Hatfields and McCoys. The Hatfields lived in Kentucky. The McCoys lived in West Virginia. They got into a feud about a pig, and McCoy thought Hatfield had stole his pig, and they would engage in a feud for about the next 30 years, where every few years the Hatfields would kill some of the McCoys. McCoys would kill the Hatfields, and so they were Appalachian mountain men. The Bedouin tribesmen, like if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabs that were living in Arabia at the time, extremely violent culture, did not tolerate insults at all, if you've seen the movie, and they were a herding culture. And then American cowboys, super famous. Well, tons of almost every Western relies on the fact that American cowboys were very violent. And so herders tend to be violent people. All right, well, are we saying that the genes of farmers and the genes of herders are different, and that's what makes them different? Well, no, probably not. There has not only not been enough time for the genes of farmers and herders to be different. We've only had agriculture for about the past 6,000 years. Not enough time for the human nervous system to have changed in any significant way. So what's going on? Well, Nisbet and Cohen, 1996, argue that cultural differences in violence between the South and North in the U.S. are the result of the different cultures brought by people who originally moved there. Okay, and that means herders from Ireland in the south and farmers from England and Germany in the north. All right, Nisbet and Cohen, 1996, argue that cultural differences in violence between the South and North in the U.S. are the result of the different cultures brought by people who originally moved there, herders from Ireland in the South and farmers from England and Germany in the North. All right, so what they're talking about here is not the entire southern United States, but the southeastern United States, the set of states that broke off and formed the Confederacy in the Civil War. So we're talking about Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and so forth. Okay, well, those places, like if you've seen Gone with the Wind, those places were first settled by Scots-Irish. These were people from Scotland. They had settled in Ireland, and then from Ireland they had moved to the United States. So like Catherine O'Hara, she's got an Irish name, and yes, it was the Scots-Irish that were the primary first colonizers of the southeastern United States. And in Ireland, they had a herding culture. They were herders, and Nisbet and Cohen have argued they've brought that herding culture to the United States. And what they're talking about with the North, probably not the Northwest, but they're talking about Iowa would be included, I think. So I think they're talking about the Midwestern states and the Northeastern states. They were primarily settled by English and German farmers who brought their farming culture with them. Now, you can see there are a number of differences culturally between the southeastern United States and the northern U.S. In terms of violence. So southern states relative to northern states place fewer restrictions on gun ownership, less likely to have laws that require homeowners to back down if they find an intruder in their house. They are more likely to execute criminals. Spanking's more likely to be allowed in schools. I know they don't allow that in Iowa, but when I was growing up in Kansas, they had a big paddle to spank people with. I almost got spanked once. I was not guilty, but I got out of it. But they do allow spanking in southern schools. They typically don't in northern schools, and southerners are more likely to be in favor of high defense spending. So all of this suggests that there's greater tolerance for violence in the South than in the North. Well, Nisbet and Cohen did this study at the University of Michigan where they were. And what they did is they had students who had grown up in the North, so northeastern United States, and then students from the Confederate states. Those were the two types of subject in their experiment. So they screened them to find out where they had grown up before they came in the experiment. Now, what they had was they gave them the address of the room they had to go to in order to do the experiment, and they had a Confederate set up at a filing cabinet. And when the subject would come to go into the room, what the Confederate would do is he'd pull the file drawer back and bump into the subject when they're about to go to the room. And then the Confederate would call the subject an asshole. Okay? Well, as soon as he called him an asshole, the research assistants would run out of the lab and immediately take a blood sample from the subject who had just been insulted. They would also ask them questions about how upset they were at the time and how angry they were. And what they found was they looked at testosterone and they looked at cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone that increases in the bloodstream when you're under stress. And what they found was that the southern students showed an increased level of both cortisol and testosterone relative to the northern students, and they also reported being much more upset than the northern students were. And it wasn't that they're always more upset, or they always show these effects. If you look at northern students and southern students who had not been insulted, well, they showed similar levels of testosterone and cortisol and similar levels of being upset. So it was the response to an insult that affected the southern students differently than it did the northern students. And then further, when they went out of the lab, they had another Confederate in the hallway when they went out of the lab, and that Confederate would go right towards the subject as they were getting out of the lab. And the question was, who was going to move first, the subject or the Confederate? And for the northern students, the subject would move out of the way. For the southern students, nope, they weren't going to move out of the way. They weren't going to be insulted again. They just would plow right into the Confederate when they came out. So all of this suggests the southern students were having a much bigger reaction to an insult than the northern students were. Now, it's not the case that its murders generally are higher in the South than in the North, but it's a lot more likely for like a bar fight or an insult to escalate into deadly violence in the South than it is in the North. So it appears to be the critical thing is in the northern culture, it is not considered acceptable to engage in violence in response to an insult. In the southern culture, it is acceptable to engage in violence in response to an insult. Now, are these cultural effects or evolutionary effects? Are the genes from people in the South different from the genes in the people in the North? Well, almost certainly not enough to explain this effect. There hasn't been that much time. I mean, America's only been around for, what, 234 years, and certainly not enough time for the genes of these people to have diverged that much. Likely, and also realize that in the South, well, what were the primary economic activities in the South prior to the Civil War? Well, it was farming cotton, and maybe to a lesser extent tobacco in the South. That was the backbone of the Southern economy. So these people had and still have a farming economy, but they still respond like the herders. Well, what must be going on, because there's not enough time for genetic effects, is this is a contingent mechanism that all of us have. And what happened, if you're in this situation where your assets might be stolen from you, you have a module that's going to make you very sensitive to insults and maybe willing to engage in violence for them. If you aren't in a situation where you have assets that are easy to steal, well, you're going to set your threshold higher for engaging in violence, and being insulted is probably not going to induce violence on your part. So what had to happen is that these people brought their culture to the South. In that culture, they were taught, yeah, it's acceptable to engage in violence in response to an insult. People in the North, they brought their culture, and in that culture, it's not. And so you kind of see, I think, the evolutionary constraints and the cultural constraints working together. We have an evolutionary contingent mechanism that makes us mad when we're in a situation where we have assets that are easy to steal. And so cultures that are in that situation, well, they codify the culture such that there won't be any consequences for you if you engage in violence in response to an insult. That's considered acceptable. And you get the opposite in the North, where in their culture, response to violence in response to an insult is not necessarily or evolutionary beneficial, and so it's stigmatized in their culture. So that's the idea. Okay. Well, let's ask, can you think of an activity in modern America where the people engaged in this economic activity have assets that are very easy to steal, and like the herders, cannot go to the police for protection if their assets get stolen? So I'll let you think about that. Pinker, 2002, argues that people engaged in the illegal drug trade have a culture of honor. Okay. That's where most of the murders in America are taking place. If you're a male in the United States today, and I know we supposedly have an extremely violent culture, but you're way more likely to be killed getting into your bathtub than you are to be murdered. And that's because we're getting less and less and less violent. The only exception is people involved in the illegal drug trade. And so if you're in the illegal drug trade, your assets are in the form of drugs or cash, either of which is super easy to steal. And if somebody steals from you, you can't go to the police to get it back. And so now you're in the same situation as a herder. So we'd expect drug dealers in particular to be very sensitive to insults. They don't want to be disrespected, right? Because if you're disrespected, if you look soft, that tells people this is somebody I can steal from. So I don't know if you've been watching Ozark, but yep, Ozark, super, super violent because people engaged in the illegal drug trade, that they're going to be violent people is the argument. All right, well, gosh, I talked a lot longer than I thought I would. I was thinking maybe bring up another topic, but I've already talked for an hour and 15 minutes, so I guess I will stop now. Now, let me mention there's no readings for next week. I'm just going to lecture the whole time next week. I'm going to do a huge Mongo lecture on altruism. So, we'll talk to you again next week. Thanks so much.